This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Kristin Surak. She has a book called The Golden Passport, Global Mobility for Millionaires. That sounds like a topic for me, a topic that I've not yet had on this podcast, one that I welcomed with open arms. Trust me, it's a topic that you don't necessarily know where it's going to go. There is some complexity. There is some detail. Since she lived in Japan for 6 years, I also go to Kristin's first book for a little bit, talking some Japanese culture, some Asian culture. One of those conversations that I always enjoy having. I hope you enjoy listening. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Kristin Surak. I'm going to jump right into the deep end with you, lay out my perspective, then we'll start to pull my perspective apart and dive into your work because you are a lot more detailed than I am. But I've got some interesting perspectives as an American guy living in Southeast Asia. So whether that's legal or illegal immigration, from the perspective also of a citizenship by investment, I've had a chance to have many meetings with one of the largest EB5 firms in the States. I don't know how much money they have under management, but it's a huge number. I have had a chance to really understand that business. It's quite interesting. It's quite a successful business. My perspective is if somebody can afford to find their way out of their situation that they don't like, and they can pay a fee and they can get a passport or they can get citizenship, I will never stop them. I won't criticize them. Gosh, if that's what they need to do, go for it. On the flip side, I look at my home country, I look at your country, I look at a lot of other Western democracies. I see, and this also rings a bell with me here, being in a place like Vietnam, but I see this illegal immigration where I can't justify the illegal immigration in Western democracies in any way, shape, or form, except that it looks like a way to get votes in the long run. Whereas in a place like Vietnam, if you can't just run across the border, you don't get a chance to really go to America, even to visit. That's my interesting perspective. I don't know, maybe some people won't find it interesting, but my perspective on this idea of changing locations, changing citizenship. It's messy. There's no equality. Life is not fair. That's how I see it. Let's start to dive into your world. You can pick apart what I just said if you want to.
You had a lot of interesting observations, but you used the term pick apart. And as an academic, that's a lot of what I do. Trying to look at people's everyday common sense understanding, then try to get behind those and see what's really going on there in the first place. You started off by saying, on the one hand, you find people aren't happy with their situations and they're finding their way out. They're able to do that. Great. Good on them for being able to do that. And when I think about the world of citizenship by investment and what it means for that, in broad strokes, yeah, that makes sense. But actually, what goes on with citizenship by investment is a little bit more complicated. Because if you look at why people want these programs, it's not always really about finding a way out. And part of that is because citizenship by investment, aka golden passport programs, where people invest or can make an economic contribution to a country and then they get citizenship in return. It's not always or even often a story of immigration, of people actually making a one-way move across borders from country A to country B. It's much more a story about mobility. It's about having the possibility to enter a country, then leave again, just simply cross the border in the first place. Or it's also often about an insurance policy for the future. You're perfectly happy with what you're doing, but you don't know what the government's going to do next. Those are the two biggest drivers. I came across other drivers as well. People look for it. Lifestyle options, people look to it for business opportunities as well. But if you look at why people go for citizenship by investment, it's not about immigration. So in that first instance, it's about upgrading one's passport possibilities. Obviously, there's a hierarchy in terms of what citizenship gets you across the planet. If you happen to have been fortunate enough to have been born in a wealthy Western country, not only do you get a lot of social protections, you get a lot of basic rights. You also get a lot of visa-free access to go where you want to go. That's not going to be the case, for example, in, say, Vietnam. A successful Vietnamese business person, I haven't looked this up, but they can probably travel to maybe about 60 countries or so visa-free. Not very many. If they were born in Japan, they would get 190. Finding their way out in the first instance can just mean easier travel to take care of business because you've got a deal that's going on and you have to be there the next day and you can't sit and wait for 3 weeks with your passport in an embassy until you can leave the country. It's just basic mobility issues in the present. I also met a lot of people who are really concerned about mobility issues in the future. They might be perfectly happy and doing perfectly well, especially in terms of business in wherever they are in the world, but they don't know what's going to happen to that government.
As you pick me apart and parse me, is it a distinction without a difference in the sense that if I just simplify a simple heuristic and I say, give me the American passport, I get everything you're talking about. So the average person, at least plenty of people that I've met, they're not necessarily at the high level saying, I only want the golden American passport or the golden Japanese passport for mobility and insurance. They're just saying, give me the passport and I'll get all the benefits that come underneath it. But I have met a significant number of people, especially in a place like Vietnam, other countries, where if the opportunity was presented, they're going. There's no doubt they're going. They are moving. They are going to sow their wild oats. They're going to go check something out. Just like on the illegal side, the Southern American border is the same thing, but that's on the illegal side.
That's a slightly different issue. Countries that do citizenship by investment aren't America. They're usually small microstates, with the big exception of Turkey. So they're places with a population of less than 1 million people and are a small island.
But to clarify also, because I brought it up earlier, the EB-5 situation, for the average person, if they can afford the fee to make the investment in America, get this EB-5 visa, okay, yeah, there's going to be rules and whatnot, but aren't they essentially getting something similar to the Caribbean islands that you're about to tell me about?
It's not the same. They often get lumped together, golden visas and golden passports, but they really are fundamentally different things. Golden visas are about investing in the country and you get the right to reside there. You might reside there long enough so that you can become a citizen in the end. But not everybody who goes for a golden visa moves on to a golden passport, in part because also a lot of countries don't allow dual citizenship. India doesn't, China doesn't. Those are pretty big markets. A lot of people are happy with just staying with the golden visa. Now, a visa residence is just a sticker and a passport. It's not a new passport. If it's residence, it's also more easily lost. Like with EB-5, if you sell that investment within the first couple of years, you're going to lose that residence permit. And if you don't spend the time in the US that's required, you're not even going to become a citizen in the end. On top of it, a visa, so it can be lost, where citizenship, you have to go through a whole denaturalization process. It's complicated. It's a much stickier legal status. Plus, it's inheritable. If you're a citizen, your children can claim citizenship. Whereas visa, that's just you. You might get one for the whole family, but it's not going to be passed down. In that sense, EB-5 is important. It's big. And a lot of countries, especially wealthy Western democracies, have these invest and get a visa program. But that's a little different from saying investing and becoming a member of the country within a couple of months.
For example, St. Kitts. I guess in St. Kitts, I can show up from whatever country. I pay the fee and I get the passport. Then that passport, when you brought up Vietnam and 60 countries, and you said Japan 190, what did you say?
Yeah, Japan is 190.
St. Kitts is going to get you well over 100 too, correct?
Yeah, it's about 120, 130, something like that.
For the audience that's unfamiliar with that, the idea that you can go to St. Kitts, a small Caribbean island, you can tell us some about the island. I've not really looked up much about it before. This issue came up before I ever had a chance to talk to you with St. Kitts in particular. It's essentially, what is it, about 150 grand for a couple, 125 per person? Is it something like that?
They recently raised the price, so it's over 200. But the lowest one is Dominica. It's about 100,000 US for a single person.
For $100,000, an individual can get the Dominica passport in how many countries?
I just looked up Vietnam. It's at 89. Dominica gets 143.
Does Dominica include America?
No. The only one that includes the US is Malta. But Dominica does for now have visa-free access to the EU, to the Schengen area, which is very valuable if, for example, you're Vietnamese. And you can always apply for a Schengen visa, but that can take some time. It might be good for only a year. You might be refused. But that visa-free access to the EU is very valuable.
The audience could feel it already from you. You've done the deep dive. You know the details. You've looked at all of this. Why did you approach it? Did you approach it with the desire to get somewhere with this understanding? What was the thinking? Ultimately, what's the belief set you have now? What drove you to go down this path of knowing these details?
People often ask me, what's my citizenship? I'm a US citizen. I've lived in the UK now long enough to become British. These are two pretty powerful citizenships. But I was looking at temporary labor migration programs that bring temporary workers into a country. They work for a period of time, but they have a hard time becoming citizens. They're supposed to go back home at the end. At about the same time, Malta started this citizenship by investment program. It was all over the news. And I thought, oh, hey, this is cool. It's the exact opposite of what I'm looking at. Rather than low-paid workers who work in a country, have a hard time becoming citizens, have to go home. These are wealthy people who buy citizenship in countries oftentimes they've never even been to in the first place. I was fascinated by that.
Does that bother you on some level when you just first hear about it like that?
I'm a sociologist. I want to understand how the world works. I'm continuously fascinated by why are things like that, rather than going in with a moral judgment saying, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's wrong, or whatever. So that was the way I approached it. This is a thing that's out there. What's really going on here? I had the opportunity to go to a conference, an industry conference around this stuff, where they had a lot of B2B, business to business networking going on, some potential buyers in the audience. And it was one of these industry making events. I went and I was like, oh my God, there's so much more going on. The media was casting it as just cash for passport deals. But there was so much more going on. It was an extended process. It was a bureaucratic process. They had some of the bureaucrats there in the audience talking about how they screen applications. They had this whole migration industry from the real estate developers, the intermediaries, to lawyers, and all these types there. And I was like, wow, this is a whole world. This whole world is being missed by these media accounts that just say, oh yeah, it's wrong. This is just cash for passports. I was just fascinated that it was so much more complex.
Most of our mainstream media accounts miss everything about everything, don't they?
They look for a good headline.
Let me let you clarify Malta, though, since you started to draw that distinction when I brought up St. Kitts and we talked about Dominica. So what is the situation with Malta and the difference? Because people listening might be saying, well, if Malta is the one that allows me to get into the States or the UK or whatnot, what are the details of Malta's program?
Malta was a very interesting program to watch come on board, to change over the years as well, mainly because it's not just the traditional countries doing this stuff, who were the majority of the market. One of their key selling points was visa-free access to the Schengen area of the European Union, most of the EU. With Malta, though, it wasn't just visa-free access. It was citizenship in an EU member state, which is a very powerful status. Because if you're a citizen of an EU member state, it's pretty much like being a citizen of all the EU member states, being a citizen of 27 other countries. If you're a Maltese citizen, you can move to Paris, put your kids in schools there, probably do some paperwork and claim some social benefits and set up your business. You're treated, you can often even vote in local elections. You're pretty much treated as a citizen of that country all across the EU. So it's an incredibly powerful status. The stakes were much higher. The price point was much higher.
What was the price point for Malta?
Originally, it was about €1 million. They had a cap on that program of about, I think, 1,600 applications approved. They reached that cap and then they launched a new program with a slightly lower price point, slightly 3 years process, but you can pay a little bit more, bring it down to a year of residence. And it becomes much more fidgety in a sense, but it was about $1 million.
You said 1,600 people?
1,600 applications. That's important to remember with these programs too, because an application is often a family. You make that one investment, but you can often bring in spouses, children, sometimes dependent parents onto that application. It's usually more people getting citizenship.
What would be the process, just to keep digging deeper here? You make this application to Malta. You want this citizenship for all the benefits that incur to you. Do you have to live there?
What's handy in the case of Malta is that you have to turn it into your residence. You have English common law, and intent is a very important part of establishing residence. You have to show the intent of making Malta your new home. So you do have to go to Malta. You do have to spend a bit of time there. You do have to rent or buy a property, and you can't sublet it or whatever. It has to be your residence. Now they have you donating to some government funds, you should join some clubs, do some charities. But in terms of actual physical presence, usually it's not a lot. It can be a couple of weeks, as long as you're showing that intent.
If we were adding up all of the things that you just outlined, a typical bare minimum investment to become a Malta citizen is going to put you at where? $1.5 million as the price for the application. Then you got to get a house. I don't know what the prices of real estate are in Malta. I know it's small. This sounds like it's getting up to probably $3 to $5 million to pull this off.
To pull it off, it'll be about $1 million plus your lawyer's fees.
But what about the house?
That's including price because that's included in the things that you have to do. You have to rent or buy a house of a minimum amount, but the rental costs, I can't remember offhand, but it's really a minimum of $1,500 a month. It's about 30,000 euros a year that you're going to be paying in rent. And you have to do that for about 5 years.
Is there a massive backlog of people that want this that can't get it?
I think for Malta, demand would be much higher if they really let the floodgates open. They have a cap on the number of applications they can approve. They can be very selective. In some years, they've been known to reject as many as 25 to 30% of applications. Right now, a lot of US tech money, especially since COVID, has been really interested in Plan B options, easy access to Europe anytime. And so a lot of people like that are looking at a place like Malta. So yeah, it's expensive, but if you can afford it, it really is top shelf.
What's so interesting about talking to you is having been in Southeast Asia for an extended period of time, over a decade, I've learned how a few things work. I'm not going to explain everything I know on this podcast, but there is a process to everything. And so I guess ultimately, I think back to a conversation someone had with me early on, CPA conversation about having a corporation and your individual taxed status. And your left pocket is you, the individual, and your right pocket is your corporation. This kind of thinking ultimately gets to too is there's perfection. People want perfection when it comes to these types of issues. But if you can allow one's mind to get past perfection and just find, can I get to a place that I want to be? That's a different way of thinking. That's a little bit more in my line of thinking, but it's a different way of thinking. There are can opener ways to solve so many issues.
Even that question of where do I want to be, that can be pure physical question. Where do I want to place myself? But it could also be existential. Where do I want to be? That raises also this question of options. Where do I want to have the option of going to? Especially for wealthy people with good passports already, like I was describing with American tech money, that's often about maximizing options. Where do I want to have the possibility of being? I don't want any doors closed in my face, which is a little bit different of where do I physically want to be. One of the things that I found interesting, especially looking at business people doing this sort of thing, is oftentimes the answer is I want to be, or I need to be where my investments are.
Isn't that where our phone is now? What does the geographic part of it have to do with anything?
Depends on the nature of the business. Things were going through the roof in Lebanon in 2021. I was in Abu Dhabi talking to some lawyers who had clients. They're like, yeah, they got citizenship by investment, but they're all still staying there because they want to protect their businesses. They're waiting until the ship to go down before they leave their businesses. But actually thinking about, say, digital nomads, people who have that mobility, then yeah, it can be where do I want to place myself? That begins to get into those issues that can be quite fascinating, like with digital nomads, what this means even for running a business or even for tax. You can be making decisions from your phone in a country with strong foreign controlled companies laws, whatever CFC laws, where if you're making decisions in that country, they may be able to claim you in terms of tax because you're making that decision on your phone there. If they have weaker ones, it's not going to matter as much. The question of where physical presence and residence becomes really tricky. I bring this up because it's also fascinating in a way. And I say this, you're a U.S. citizen. What U.S. state are you from?
Virginia.
Virginia. I'm from South Carolina. And I haven't lived there in about 30 years. And what's nuts is that I can vote for the president of the U.S., one of the most powerful positions in the world, because I'm somehow a resident of a state where I've spent absolutely no time in the past 30 years.
Have you paid your South Carolina taxes every year?
I fill out the forms. I don't make enough money to have to pay them.
You go through the process of doing that every year. You could leave South Carolina. You don't have to be still affiliated with South Carolina. That's your choice, right?
Absolutely. But I'm not physically present there. Residence is different from physical presence in the eyes of the law. In terms of how the law defines us, in a globally mobile world, we're moving across borders, we're doing work from our iPhone, we're doing certain things here, there, whatever. It's interesting what that means legally for us and the different legal attachments we have. And one of the things that's interesting too in all of this and thinking about the difference between physical presence and residence and those sorts of attachments is that citizenship is really sticky. We take it wherever we go. You might have a medical degree from country A, but if you move to country B, they're not going to recognize it. You don't count as a doctor in their eyes. But if you're a citizen, they're still going to count you that. It follows you. That layer of complexity there, I think, is really fascinating to watch in terms of those questions of mobility, immigration, where people are going, how countries attach or how they detach.
I'm sitting here holding your fine book. I know it's not the main focus of where you go, but I can't help but look at this issue and then think of the side issue that I brought up in my initial setup. We're talking about the golden passports, legal schemes designed by countries to allow people to get citizenship by investment. I just say to myself, how many people every day with significant assets who don't want to deal with whatever laws exist? Maybe they're of a certain age where they say, you know what, I'm not going to travel anymore. Maybe I've got some friends and family in America. Maybe I don't, but I've got money. Why should I not walk across the Rio Grande? Just stay, because that is an option. I see all these complicated options, but then I see these simplified options, whether they're taking the boat across the Mediterranean to Italy, or they're rolling into Paris, or they're rolling into London. This option of not doing it the proper way seems to be a legitimate option.
Well, a lot of people do it anyways because they don't have alternatives. People with money tend to go for the legitimate one. You can build a business in the US or put your kids in schools. There's all sorts of ways to work around because people with money tend to want the protection of law around what they're doing in these countries. You don't want to get deported, whereas people without money are willing to take those risks.
Okay, but let me clarify. Who's getting deported from America? That doesn't exist. That's an old, outdated concept. That doesn't happen anymore. If you get to America, you get to stay there.
No, people do get deported when they get caught. There are big detention centers, especially along the border with Mexico. People do get sent back, and Mexico is getting paid to hold South American people from Central America to keep them from coming in.
But there's millions upon millions of people that have been rolling into America for the last 10 years. The population is not just increasing for babies, it's increasing for people that are just rolling across the border. Everybody with a pulse can see the news. My question becomes, okay, we've got the complicated ways, and you as a fine sociologist, we've got the complicated ways, but I don't know, if I had some money, why would I not look at the idea, if I know I really don't have to leave, I'm not so sure the data supports that a ton of people are being deported from America anymore. The news accounts that I see and the numbers that I see, it sure looks like people know if they get there, they don't have to go home. You think that's not a fair assessment?
There's something like 250,000 deportation orders. There's going to be a lot of undocumented people. There was something like in 2018, 330,000 people were deported from the US. So it's not nothing.
If I look at Europe, I look at America, I see this interesting topic that you're right in the heart of, which is the buy your way in legally. And then I see other people that are just hacking the system that we all assume are poor, but I don't know why I'm making that assumption.
What happens usually, people who are quote unquote illegal don't have the right documents to be in the country. Usually what happens is they've crossed the border legally. They cross the border very often on a tourist visa and overstay. So that's the most common way of producing what's known as illegal migration. People overstay the visa so they no longer have the right papers. If you can float below the system long enough, then until they catch you or until you leave, because that's the other thing that's risky is that if you're in without the right papers, when you leave, then is the time when you can also be caught. Things get tricky for going back again as well, especially if your wait in the first place was you just came on a residence permit and overstayed. What's really crucial in thinking about immigration or people moving across borders, entering a country in that way, is that all countries screen. You don't get open borders really. Within the EU, you have open borders between EU countries in a way, but you also have a hard border on the outside. We don't live in a world of no borders. Countries screen. They usually screen based on some version of economics. I live in the UK. I was able to become a British citizen. I came here on a work visa, but basically I got a work visa because I'm super highly educated with a PhD. They wanted me. It was called talent. But really, it's because I was born in a wealthy country and was able to go to college and all of that, a proxy for money in a way. A lot of migration screens either based on having an economically successful background in some degree or family connection. Your spouse, your ancestor, whatever is from that place, so you're able to get a visa and go there as well. And especially in the West, those family ties, also talent or skill, are the main ways that countries screen to decide who gets to come in for a longer time? Who gets to have a work visa? It's interesting talking to people who come from countries with very privileged passports in the first place, like US citizens. They'll be like, yeah, I want to move to France. How do I do that? You've got to get a visa if you want to be there for more than 3 months because they have an immigration policy and they screen. Of course, that US citizen could move to France and overstay their visa. But the moment they try to leave the Schengen area, they'll get caught and they won't be allowed back in for another 3 years unless they can convince the country that they can come into their visa regime. They tick the right boxes and they can get a residence permit. And all countries do that. But that's a little bit different because those are immigration questions, which is a little bit different from a golden passport. Because a golden passport is, most of the time, people aren't moving to those countries. They don't even want to go to those countries. And what's interesting here is we often think of citizenship as about the right to get you in a country, or even what you're talking about in terms of illegal migration. People come in a country and they get a lot of benefits and they build a life or do whatever. But with citizenship by investment, what people are interested in are the rights that citizenship gets you outside of your country. Becoming a citizen of St. Kitts is often about how do I get visa-free access to the EU? Becoming a citizen of Malta can be how do I go and live in Switzerland? It can be something like becoming a citizen of Turkey because Turkey has an E2 visa with the US, moving to Istanbul, and then using that to start a business in the US and getting a residence permit in the US in the end. And it's those third country benefits that our citizenship gets us. Number one, in cross-border mobility, but all sorts of other benefits that we often don't think about. Cases you're giving is about people want to go to the US and make the most of the US system. Whereas the cases I'm talking about, it's people who want citizenship in Malta because of what being Maltese gets them outside of that country.
Do you have a perspective in terms of good or bad on this process of the Golden Passport? It's a general question because there's a lot of different countries participating with a lot of different programs. But just overall, as I listen to you, are you being the good professor that's outlining here are all the options? I talk to a lot of professors on this podcast, and trust me, there's a lot of opinionated professors that are highly political. I'm not hearing that from you, okay?
Maybe it's because I did grow up in South Carolina. I was like, whoa, what is this world that I live in? How do you explain this stuff? I'm just fascinated with the everyday and trying to explain that. I see them as they're a policy option that's out there. Countries know that's out there. They're starting them on their own. Often service providers who make a lot of money off of this go and try to promote these programs as well. They're a policy option. Especially if you're a small country, less than 1 million people, it can be a huge moneymaker as well. It comes with some benefits too, but it can also bring risks. Part of that is they can be better structured so that more of the money goes into the country and helps develop it. It also brings the risk that you let in the wrong types of people. And there have been plenty of cases, not the majority. Some people, if you read the standard media, you think that, oh yeah, everybody going through is a criminal and a money launderer and a tax evader. It's really a very small percentage of people like that. But you can still find those cases. And that is a risk for these countries because it's a big reputational risk in terms of what they're doing. And because these countries, the value of their citizenship hinges on what that citizenship gets them outside of that country. It means that other countries control them.
Not to go back to the legal side much, because that's not really my point, but when you talk about the screening on the legal golden passport side, sure, they're not going to let the MS-13 gang member with face tats in, but the illegal side is going to, because I know I just got back from visiting Northern Virginia where my family lives. That's a pretty common thing. And you realize that those folks did not go through a screening. That's not a screening at all. Look, I got a question though about you. Back with my point a second ago. I speak to a lot of professors in this podcast. Lost count on the Harvard side of how many Harvard professors. The one thing I can remember about almost every Harvard professor I've had on in the last handful of years is there's no doubt about their political persuasion. It is always loud and clear. It's almost interesting, this myopic thing. They might say some term or something where they just assume that this is normal. And I ask them about it. You can feel the offense building, whereas you seem to be what I recall professors used to be, which is, here are the facts. Let's talk about stuff. Don't try to indoctrinate people to something. So why are you acting like what professors used to act like? I don't understand. Why have you not been converted to something? I don't get it.
Yeah, why do I not have a political agenda that I'm trying to assert by doing research? Instead, I just want to uncover how does the world work?
I'm trying to figure it out. There's something hidden behind door 3 that I'm waiting to be thrown at me. I can't find it. I'm trying to.
As I think about all of that, growing up in the US, I somehow never really identified with it. I always wanted to get out. maybe the hidden boogeyman in the closet is that I always wanted to get out and be a part of the rest of the world. And so if there's any fundamental thing in this, it's what would be my unquestioned common sense imposition on the world is that why are these countries grasping onto people in particular ways? What is that doing?
I understand that perspective. I'll share with you. I got started, I guess, in my mid-20s, spent my last semester of grad school, last semester of an MBA program in London. If I was not a poor grad student, I probably never would have left London, but I had a blast. I lived on Hallam Street right there in W1. It was so much fun. It was great, a great experience to be there. My company is called Marleybone Holdings, so there you go. I'm always surprised no one's come to me and said, hey, can I buy marleybone.com? I've had it for 20 plus years. Those things change you. I don't get a chance to speak to too many Americans that have that perspective of going abroad, because I can remember even before I did it, you hear the term expat or this or that. It sounds like something weird about that person or whatever. And then you get outside the bubble and you're like, wow, okay, this is quite fun. This is quite interesting. And then you go back into the bubble. I was just in the bubble last week and you're like, okay, I don't know what's going on here anymore, but you people are drinking Kool-Aid on top of Kool-Aid. I'm not even talking about whatever political persuasion. People are in this weird space in America that I don't relate to at all anymore.
I can totally relate to that. I lived in Japan for 6 years. I went as far different as I possibly could on that, living in a small island, learning fluent Japanese, and almost as a cleansing thing of what are the other possibilities of seeing and being in the world, different perspectives and all of that.
Let's keep it there for a second, because I have to tell you, I live in a country where when it comes to aspirational perspectives, the Vietnamese look at the Japanese, the Korean, the Taiwanese, and the Singaporean, and they say, gosh, we want to get to where you guys are. And it probably starts with the Japanese, especially across most of Asia, because it is just an amazing culture. I've had a chance to spend a decent amount of time there, not as much as you, but I've got a decent feel for it. And it's just an amazing place. If somebody said to me, okay, Mike, you can only eat one cuisine. You got to be in that country to eat that cuisine for the rest of your life. Where are you going? If anyone says something other than Japanese, they just don't have any experience. They've got a mental problem, because the food in Japan is amazing. Everything is perfect. It's psycho almost how perfect it is.
My first book was on the Japanese tea ceremony, which is a great excuse to have kaiseki, Japanese haute cuisine, 12-course meal in a beautiful setting, while you're doing your PhD research as an impoverished student, and make the most of Japanese hospitality. It was fantastic. I thought the only way I could do better than that is to come up with a research project that included going to a bunch of tropical islands and calling it research.
I'm holding in my hand a bottle of Ituin tea, a dark, unsweetened green tea, which I drink about 4 or 5 bottles of it per day for the last 25 years. I don't know how I got addicted to it. I have it imported wherever I'm at. I have it shipped in. Here's the funny thing, too. I'm talking about bottled tea. It's not the same as the tea ceremony you're talking about. But I will have to say, you can buy this kind of tea in America through an American-shaped bottle. But if I get it, which happens here in Vietnam, if I get it imported directly from Japan, the taste is entirely different.
I don't drink matcha or have matcha anything outside of Japan. It's all over the planet now, but I'm like, nope. There are 4 growers who I trust for top quality matcha. They're only in Japan. It's so hard to find it outside. Not worth it.
But stuff. But that must have been an amazing experience. Let me ask you also, in terms of that, I have not read your book about the Japan tea ceremony, but the title includes the word nationalism in it, nationalistic. Can you repeat the title?
It's called Making Tea, Making Japan, Cultural Nationalism in Practice.
How does the word nationalism fit in there? My curiosity, having not read the book. It's such an interesting word.
It's a complicated word, too. My book was translated into Japanese, and the valence of nationalism in Japanese, nationalism, is so politically charged that people were so immediately criticized. I'm using the term in a slightly different way. I'm using it as sort of a social sciencey term, that's cultural nationalism is coming out of that. But what I was really interested in was nationhood, nationness, that sense of belonging to nation that many of us in the world have. Many of us have it. Mine is pretty weak in general. I think that's why I was happy to leave the US. But a lot of people have a strong attachment to the country. What's fascinating is a lot of people take that for granted now, but it's historically contingent. The world was not always like that. So even Japan, which is often taken as, oh yeah, it's like the Japanese people have been on these islands. It's so been clearly a nation for millennia. 300 or 400 years ago, if you went to a peasant in a rural Japan or on an island or whatever and asked where they were from, they would give the name of their local domain, maybe their local village, then maybe their local domain, but they wouldn't have stood up and said proudly, I am Japanese. They were peasants. Their world is much more limited. They wouldn't have gone off and said, and now I'm going to sacrifice myself in the army for Japan. That transformation, where it's not just the elite who have national identity in that way, but everybody, including peasants, this becomes a relevant identity in their world. It's only been around for about 100 years or so, but it's become so powerful. People will say, yeah, I'm a proud American. I'm going to die for my country. Looking at the tea ceremony, I was interested in how this cultural practice, it's making tea, how that has become such a condensation of what Japan is, what it means to be Japanese, because historically, it was what samurai did and elite men did, negotiations. It was a way of showing that you were a good elite man, not a good Japanese citizen. And it was in the late 19th and early 20th century, it became a way of becoming a good Japanese citizen. So much so that it becomes this ultimate cultural symbol of Japan, that even the top grand tea master in the country has become the Japanese cultural ambassador to the United Nations. He's like the living embodiment, not of tea knowledge, but of knowledge of how to be a good Japanese person. I was fascinated by that transformation, in part because I have a fairly weak national identity myself. If one looks for a connection in between the two books, those two projects, it's really there. With golden passports, people buying citizenship, that identity side of citizenship is weak if they're at all. And usually it's not there at all. People want membership in the state and the legal benefits that state membership brings them. The membership in the nation is another thing. That identity side is very weak. That malleability that I find fascinating between the two cases.
The comparison for me to compare most Asian countries, Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, to compare most Asian countries, their use and belief in nationalism, even as you say, maybe, okay, this is only going back 100 years, to compare it to America. I think a lot of Americans will say, yes, I'm proud to be an American. But then I look at how the country has evolved. Again, we've talked about some of these issues in this conversation, and I don't see the nationalism necessarily. Whereas in a place in some of the Asian countries that I just mentioned, I do see the nationalism. I see it not only that people will say it, but you see it operationally, meaning if I go to Japan, I'm going to see primarily Japanese. It's not a multicultural place, except for extreme minority. Same for China, same for Vietnam, etc. Mike, me, the white guy in Vietnam, I'm an extreme minority, okay? That's just the way it is. This is an interesting comp to see this between our home country and Asian countries when it comes to this word nationalism.
For me, it's also a variable possibility, a variable property. It varies from person to person, varies from context. The context varies depending on where you're going. But it's one of those things that one can easily be the fish in water. You just take it for granted where you are, because that's just the way things are. But it's when you're thrown into a totally different context that all the differences stand out. And they might stand out for you. Maybe they become more normalized over time. But other people, you still stand out for them. They make those differences relevant for you, even if you may not be thinking about it at all. I can totally get what you mean. When you go to the US, it doesn't seem so powerful. And I think part of that is because it might be a little bit of the fish and water thing, where people aren't throwing in your face all the time, oh yeah, here comes the big white guy coming down the street.
Another part of this too is that you and I growing up in America, we know the conversation is, okay, diversity is our strength. If a country keeps saying diversity is our strength and really promotes that as, hey, we're number one, diversity is our strength, then what does that mean for Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, and China? Because they are not diverse. That's the interesting part for me, is that their homogeneity is their strength.
For me, that's an empirical question. If you look at, then, say, Singapore's pretty diverse.
Singapore's 5 million people, and it's a bunch of rich people. I love Singapore. I've got a lot of Singaporean friends. I can't draw too many conclusions from Singapore, just like I can't draw too many conclusions from Australia or New Zealand.
Fair enough. I think there's also, when people talk about diversity, especially in the US context, they often talk about racial or racialized diversity rather than class diversity. And that class diversity can be huge as well. But you could take a case like Myanmar, which has a lot of ethnic diversity, but a strong Burmese slant to the government and all of that. Whether or not it's a strength or not, I don't know. For me as a sociologist, what's interesting is the claims that are being made. How is this claim being made and asserted, and what is that claim being used to do?
Here's the weakness in the armor that I just think I found. I'm writing these numbers down. So Indonesia is 275 million people. Vietnam's 100 million. Indonesia's 120 million. China's 1.4 billion. Japan's 120 million. Korea's 60 million. Thailand's 60 million. Myanmar's about 60 million. All the other countries beyond Myanmar, which I've been to Yangon, and I have to tell you, I've never seen more diverse looking faces in my life than to go to there, because it's clearly where India and Asia are meeting. All the stands. And so that was the most diverse places in the world. If we put that outlier aside and we stick with China, Vietnam, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia.
Indonesia's pretty diverse island to island.
Okay, if we stick with East Asia, Korea and Japan and China, Vietnam, close to 2 billion people. That's a lot of people.
Only because of China, but okay, fair enough.
There's not a lot of diversity there. If you say diversity is our strength, I said the weakness that I thought there is you were not willing to say that their strength is their homogeneity.
China still claims diversity because the official Chinese line, it's whatever, 90% Han Chinese. But the official Chinese line is 55 plus 1, 55 ethnic minorities plus Han Chinese. And that's part of the formal construction of the national identity by the government of Beijing.
Okay, you and I walk the streets. We pick the cities. We walk the streets. I think you know where I'm going here.
They're 90% Han Chinese.
My point ultimately, is there something to the sociologists at the LSE? Is there something wrong with having, hey, our strength is our homogeneity. Hey, our strength is our diversity. Look, we're two Americans. We grew up in this. This is what we heard every day of our life. Then you come, I come. You've lived in Asia. You've lived in Japan. I've lived in Vietnam. We know if we say these countries are strong, diversity is not their strength. Okay, maybe there's diversity in social class, but there's not diversity in race.
What I'm interested in is what are those claims doing? Because you could say there's not racial diversity, but there is class diversity. There's a lot of opinion diversity. For me, it's interesting in looking at Japan, for example, is there's a very strong claim that Japan is a homogeneous society and the government, part of the official government line, you talk to a lot of people, they're like, yeah, Japan is a homogeneous society. This is a big claim, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but if it's so homogeneous, one of the things is we're very aware of other Japanese, we're very polite. We could coordinate so that there's not a lot of rudeness on public transportation, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but why is it when I ride the subway at midnight, there's drunk people sprawled out all over the floors in a way that I would never even see in London? That's a weird kind of diversity that gets covered up by those claims of we're a homogeneous society. So is it there? Is it not? That's an empirical question. And you'd have to look at a particular case of what's going on. But for me, as a sociologist, where I generally start is, why is that claim being made and what's that claim trying to do? I even make an assertion, who is that hour behind it? It's a national hour in all these cases. Why make that claim in the first place?
That was my whole point. Our country makes this claim about diversity. I live in Asia. I see homogeneity. And so I'm saying, well, hold on. I've already made the point several times to you. It might make you a little itchy. I don't know. I ask questions sometimes that people, I don't know where he's going to go with this. I don't want to be on the record about where he's going. I wasn't going anywhere other than making the simple observation that when people come to East Asia, you realize, oh, wow, these very large countries with all of this success and all of this history are pretty homogenous. I haven't been in Cambodia. I look at the difference when I see, even going in Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam, and I say to myself, oh my gosh, they must have fought wars to keep the differences of people separated, because you can see the differences between countries. The borders in Asia are definitely borders that were fought for, whatever the reasons were. Your third book, okay, I'm giving you the idea. You've done 2 books. You're working on your third, right?
Yeah, the third one's on digital nomads. Continuing that question of mobility, mobile populations, how countries try to attract certain kinds of people, wanted people for a particular amount of time, but then they let go of them. Then how these mobile populations select among countries and decide to go to a place for a bit of our time and then move on again.
I first got exposed to that concept in 2013 when I first came to Vietnam. There was a whole collection of American white guys primarily that were running around Southeast Asia. I'd already had some success and could live wherever I wanted to live. And so it wasn't part of my thing, but I had a chance to meet and talk with a lot of these guys. Some ended up having great success. Some are probably back living in their mom's basement. It was interesting to see their perspectives, though. I sometimes wondered with some of the guys, a lot of them were leaving, and it was primarily young men, but getting away in their early 20s to some foreign locale. But I thought so many of them didn't really have a good foundation for supporting themselves over time. Even if some of them were very bright, some of them developed some type of online software and some tried to and some failed. But it was an interesting process to get into the mindset of some of these young guys that were doing that. Many of them were probably in their 30s and 40s now. They were on that first wave of, at least for coming to Asia, the digital nomads.
That is really interesting. Yeah, those are the sort of people that I need to start meeting up with and talking to figure out. I'm curious about what are those decision processes? How do you make those choices? Do you have a need to feel like somewhere is home or not? Or what do people, quote unquote, back home say to you about that? What are other ways that you find grounding or make those decisions in the world?
I know you're not necessarily asking me, you're asking the general question, but from my perspective, it was really simple. I was single. That's one issue. The second issue, everybody was really nice. And number three, no crime, zero crime. I'm sure there's something behind the scenes, but overall, something that I had never seen or experienced, which is you can't go to big American cities without feeling a threat, whether you're walking the streets or whether you're on the subway. To not see that was endearing. I was like, wow, okay, somebody's figured something out in this part of the world that America's lost sight of.
It's interesting what becomes important to a person, and that's been absent. But when you do have it and you do find it, wow, this kind of fits. This is where I'd like to be.
In America, when the lobster pot boiling already, so everyone just accepts it and says, it's okay. That guy's doing number 2 on the sidewalk. It's okay. That guy just shot somebody. We just accept it. It's crazy.
Also to understand different perspectives on the world, different ways of being, and to even try doing that oneself. So like for me, the countries where I've really lived, the UK doesn't count because I get by with my American accent here anyways. I lived in Germany for several years. I lived in Japan for several years. And I also picked up the languages in both. Because that also means that in addition to not letting things ride like that, you also develop a different perspective on the world, even in language. In Japanese, you're always saying, "Otsukare-sama desu." Literal translation is, "Oh, you must be so tired." You say it all the time. Even if you get off an elevator, the elevator operator will say, "Otsukare-sama." And you're like, I didn't do anything. You're the one who pushed the button.
The Vietnamese say this to me in English.
Puts you in a different mode of being in the world that also I think is wonderful. It's very mind expanding. And that's so fundamental. A lot of people, especially with this book on citizenship, it did end up being called the Golden Passport. But what's really fundamental is that a passport is not citizenship. You can have a passport from a country and not be a citizen. A lot of people with diplomatic passports are not citizens. But you can be a citizen of a country without a passport. And the fact that the majority of US citizens don't have passports is really indicative. Despite that it's this global superpower, it makes loads of decisions and military interventions that affect so many people around the planet. Most Americans have never left their home country.
And in defense of those folks, there's 2 big oceans and America's a huge place.
That's true.
The book, The Golden Passport. Kristin, cool stuff. I should remind the audience here that we've gone all around on all kinds of subjects. This is a little bit different than, like I said, the typical book that I will see from the typical professor in the sense that it really is a deep dive. It's not political. The only thing I was able to get you on political a little bit is this diversity and homogeneity that you didn't want to touch. But there's a lot of people that want to know more about this subject. I highly recommend for people, if they want their first step of jumping in, you've done the hard work for them. Congratulations.
Thanks so much. Hopefully it's a fun read too. Hopefully it's not the dry academic stuff.
Where can we send people, Kristin? Where would you like to direct the book? On Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Where would you like to send people?
The book is on Amazon.
What's your best website?
I really need to make one. My best website is probably going to be the one that's there in about a month's time. But I am on my LSE website. If you look for LSE, London School of Economics, Surak, you come up to my website and a lot of my publications up there too. You can see some of the essays, you can see some of the academic work, but the book was written with a popular audience in mind. It even has Robert De Niro under a big balloon covered in passports in Montenegro, pitching citizenship in a Caribbean country halfway around the world. It's meant to be a fun read, so I do recommend that. Wait a month for me to figure out how to make a website. I'm not a digital nomad myself.
Kristin, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for appearing.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money. Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.